There are moments when you sit alone and wonder why heaven feels silent, why the answers you seek remain unclear, why the guidance you prayed for still hasn't come. You believe, you wait, you try, but somewhere deep inside you know something is not connecting. Something is clouding the channel. Something is standing in the way of clarity. Hearing the voice of God is not reserved for the spiritual elite. It is not only for prophets or preachers or those who live in quiet monasteries. It is for the ordinary soul, for the one who walks through life quietly, seeking answers in silence, for the one who wrestles with questions when no one is watching. God speaks. He has always spoken, but often we do not hear, not because he is silent, but because we are not tuned in. Because something in us or around us has made it harder to recognize his voice. There's no formula to force God to speak, but there's a way to make your heart more receptive. There are choices that make the spiritual atmosphere around you more clear. And there are habits, subtle ones, repeated ones, familiar ones, that slowly shut the door to spiritual sensitivity. This reflection is not about judgment. It is not a list meant to shame. It is a gentle walk through the soul's room, pointing to the clutter that needs to be cleared. You may not realize how much noise surrounds your heart. You may not notice how often you've kept God at the edge of your thoughts, though you keep calling on him. Sometimes the reason we cannot hear is not because God is far, but because we are full. Full of distractions, full of wounds, full of doubt, full of things we've learned to live with but were never meant to carry. When the soul is quiet, the spirit speaks. But silence is not just the absence of sound. It is the letting go of things that compete with the whisper of God. In this reflection, we are going to explore the most common habits that quietly block the voice of God. You may find one, you may find several, but with each one, you are not being pushed down. You are being invited to return, invited to listen again, invited to clear the path. This is not a call to be perfect. It is a call to be aware, to pause, to make room. The voice of God does not shout over our noise. He waits until we are willing to hear. And sometimes hearing begins with quitting. Quitting habits that have stayed too long. Quitting the clutter that once helped us cope. But now only clouds our spirit. This is not about fear. It is about clarity, not about condemnation, but reconnection. Habit 1. Constant distractions on media. The soul was not designed to scroll endlessly. It was not shaped for constant flashing images, nonstop updates, or the noise of hundreds of voices competing for attention. Yet that is what many hearts are exposed to daily. Every time you reach for your phone without intention, something shifts. Not always loudly, but enough to draw your mind elsewhere. The voice of God is still, gentle, and personal. But constant distractions from media can drown that voice before it even reaches your heart. Most people do not realize how much media noise they consume. A video here, a message there, a short clip that leads to another, and soon a quiet hour is gone. Not only does it steal time, it fragments the mind. It pulls the spirit in many directions. And even when you try to sit still before God, your thoughts are still echoing with images you did not ask to see, sounds you did not plan to hear, and opinions you never searched for. Over time, this becomes normal. The stillness of God starts to feel strange. Silence becomes uncomfortable. The attention span begins to shrink. Distraction is not always sinful, but it is costly. It builds a wall between your spirit and divine awareness. God does not shout to compete with your phone. He does not demand attention. He waits until you return, until you pause, until you are quiet enough inside to recognize His presence again. Media is not the enemy, but when it becomes the background of every free moment, the voice of God becomes harder to hear. Clarity takes focus, and spiritual clarity will never grow in a crowded, noisy mind. You may not need to quit media completely, but you may need to quiet it to hear Him again. Habit 2, unforgiveness. Unforgiveness is a quiet barrier. It doesn't always scream in the heart. Sometimes it settles like a shadow that never leaves. It hides behind memories, behind reasons, behind explanations that feel justified. But even when it is silent, it closes the ears of the spirit. It makes the heart hard to reach. It creates distance, not just from others, but from God. When the heart holds on to offense, it becomes heavier. It carries layers of things unsaid, moments replayed, and wounds that are kept alive by the refusal to let go. Forgiveness is not pretending nothing happened. It's not saying the pain was small. It's not giving approval to the wrong. Forgiveness is releasing the hold. It is saying, I will not let this wound decide how my spirit lives. God speaks in a space that is free, not perfect, but open. And unforgiveness fills that space with noise, not the loud kind, but the subtle kind. The resistance, the walls, the closed-off corners that say, I will listen to God, but not hear. And so that part of your life becomes closed. The voice of God does not force its way in. It does not crush through bitterness. It waits for the heart to soften. It waits for the soul to say, I'm ready to stop carrying what was never mine to hold. Sometimes, unforgiveness is not about a person. It is about yourself. It is about not letting go of what you regret, not forgiving the version of you that failed or didn't know better or broke something that mattered. But the same truth still stands. As long as you hold on, you close the door. Forgiveness doesn't make the pain disappear, but it clears the space so God can speak again. Habit 3, willful sin. There is a difference between weakness and willfulness. Everyone falls. Everyone struggles. But when sin is chosen, protected, and repeated without repentance, it begins to silence the voice of God. It's not that He stops speaking. It's that the heart becomes less able to hear. Willful sin dulls the conscience. It numbs the inner awareness. It convinces the soul that peace can live beside disobedience. But peace without alignment is not peace. It is delay. Willful sin is not always dramatic. It is often quiet. It hides in excuses. It settles into routines. It learns how to blend into spiritual language. It creates a version of faith that looks active on the outside, but is disconnected inside. The voice of God becomes something that is remembered, not experienced. It becomes something others hear, while you only hear silence. God does not withdraw because He is angry. He waits because the relationship has shifted. His voice is pure. It does not flow freely into spaces that refuse His truth. It is not punishment. It is separation caused by choices. And every time you say yes to what you know is wrong, your ability to hear what is right becomes weaker. Willful sin closes the door, slowly. It does not always feel like rebellion. Sometimes it feels like control, comfort, or personal freedom. But the cost is always clarity. When the heart chooses darkness knowingly, the light becomes distant. The whispers become faint, and the direction you seek becomes harder to find. To hear God clearly, the soul must be honest. Not perfect, but honest. Willful sin resists that honesty. It defends itself, but the moment you choose truth again, the voice returns. Not to shame you, but to lead you back where you were always meant to be. Habit 4, Neglecting prayer and the Word. The voice of God is not a sound that falls from the sky at random. It is a voice that flows through relationship, and relationship requires presence. Without prayer, there is no conversation. Without the Word, there is no grounding. Many long to hear God, but seldom pause to listen, not because they don't believe, but because they've grown used to functioning without communion. Days pass, routines continue, and slowly the habit of seeking becomes a memory. Prayer is not a performance. It is not about saying the right things in the right order. It is about showing up, sitting still, speaking simply, listening fully. It is the quiet place where the Spirit meets its source. But when prayer is neglected, the Spirit starts to drift, not always into sin, but into dryness. The heart forgets the sound of closeness. The thoughts fill up with other voices. The inner compass begins to weaken. The Word is not just a book. It is the language of God's voice. It is the anchor that holds your hearing in place. Without it, impressions become confusion, feelings take the place of truth, and soon the ability to discern what is from God and what is not starts to fade. You cannot recognize a voice you do not spend time with. You cannot understand a message you do not study. Neglect is quiet. It doesn't shout. It simply delays. It replaces the eternal with the immediate. And over time, it leaves the soul empty. To hear God again, you do not need to make promises. You just need to return. Not perfectly, not with long prayers, just with presence. When you begin again, the voice that seemed lost is found again, in the place it has always waited. Habit 5. Doubt and unbelief. Doubt and unbelief often sit quietly in the heart, like shadows in the corners of a room. They do not always shout, but they affect everything. When you seek to hear the voice of God, these feelings create a barrier, one that is not built of bricks, but of hesitation and uncertainty. God's voice calls with clarity, but doubt causes the soul to hesitate, to question, to turn away just before understanding arrives. Unbelief does not mean the absence of faith entirely. It can be small, a lingering question, a hesitation to trust fully, a quiet skepticism that grows over time. These moments are natural, but when they become the habit, they dull the spirit's sensitivity. The voice of God requires a heart willing to receive, even when the answers are not immediate or easy to understand. Doubt often tries to protect us from disappointment, from pain, from the unknown. But in doing so, it shuts the door on possibility. It places limits on what God can do. It turns expectation into suspicion. And in that place, the voice of God becomes harder to recognize. Faith is not the absence of questions. It is the willingness to listen beyond them. It is the quiet decision to trust when the path is unclear. Doubt and unbelief are not failures, but when they become walls, they need to be noticed, not to be condemned, but to be gently understood and released. To hear God clearly, the soul must be open, not perfect, but willing. Even when the voice seems faint, even when the heart is unsure, the willingness to listen without closing down is what invites clarity back into the spirit. Doubt can remain as a shadow, but it need not be the voice that controls the room. Habit 6. Fear and anxiety. Fear and anxiety settle quietly in the heart, often without announcing their arrival. They create a tension inside that pulls the mind in many directions, leaving little room for stillness. When the spirit is restless, it becomes difficult to hear the gentle voice of God. The noise of worry drowns out the calm whisper meant for the soul. Fear is a natural response to uncertainty, but when it becomes a habit, it builds walls, inside that blocked peace. Anxiety feeds on what ifs and maybes, creating shadows where there should be light. These feelings do not disappear by ignoring them, yet when they fill every moment, they steal the space where faith can grow. The voice of God speaks in calm, but fear and anxiety make the spirit restless, unsettled, and distracted. When fear controls, it narrows the focus to survival and protection. The soul begins to listen only to the urgent, the loud, the alarming. The still, steady voice of God becomes harder to distinguish amid the chaos. Anxiety invites the heart to imagine worst outcomes, which can mute hope and trust. In this place, hearing clearly is a challenge. God's voice is always there, waiting for the soul to return to quiet. It does not compete with fear or rush to silence anxiety. Instead, it invites a slow, steady presence, a gentle invitation to rest in truth beyond feelings. To hear God, the heart must be willing to pause, even if fear remains, not by pretending it's gone, but by choosing to listen beyond it. Fear and anxiety are part of being human, but they need not be the loudest voices in your life. Creating space for calm, even in small moments, opens the door for God's voice to be heard again. It is in the quiet that trust begins to replace worry, and clarity softly returns. Habit 7. Pleasing people above God. Pleasing others is a natural desire. It is part of connection and care, but when the need to be accepted, liked, or approved becomes greater than the desire to follow God, the voice of God grows distant. The soul begins to listen more to human opinions than to divine guidance. This shift happens quietly, almost without notice. Choices start to align with what will avoid conflict or win favor rather than what aligns with truth. When people-pleasing takes priority, the heart wears a mask. It adjusts, hides, or changes to fit expectations. It listens for approval more than conviction. The inner compass begins to spin, confused by the many voices competing for attention. God's voice is steady and true, but it is gentle. It will not force its way in when the spirit is divided. This habit is not about rejecting kindness or respect. It is about recognizing when the need for acceptance becomes a wall between you and God. It's easy to slip into doing what feels safe or popular instead of what feels right. But the cost is clarity. The more you seek to please people, the less space there is for God's voice to speak. Hearing God clearly requires a heart willing to stand in truth, even when it is uncomfortable. It asks for honesty with yourself and with others. It allows the freedom to say no to approval if it means saying yes to God. This does not mean isolation or harshness, but balance. It means tuning out the noise of judgment or expectation to tune in to the quiet guidance of the Spirit. The voice of God calls for authenticity, not approval. When you choose to follow that voice above all else, you open the door to clear, steady guidance that will never lead you wrong. Hearing the voice of God is not always easy. It asks for patience, quiet, and honesty with ourselves. The habits we carry, distractions, unforgiveness, willful sin, neglect, doubt, fear, and the need to please people, each quietly close the door to clarity. They do not shout their power, but their effect is real. They shape the space where God's voice can be heard. This reflection is an invitation to notice what might be blocking your hearing. It is not a call to perfection, but to awareness, to gently consider the ways your spirit may be crowded or closed. The voice of God waits patiently, not to condemn, but to guide. It waits for a heart willing to listen, even when that means letting go. Letting go is not always simple. It is a process, a journey. But every step toward clearing these habits is a step toward clarity. The silence you have felt may not be emptiness, but the quiet before hearing again. In that space, God speaks softly, steadily, truly. May this awareness bring peace, not pressure, and the gentle courage to open your heart to the voice that has always been there, waiting. Thank you for taking this time to reflect. If this message has spoken to you, feel free to come back anytime and listen again. May your heart grow quiet enough to hear clearly, and may you walk with peace in the journey ahead. Take care and be well.